Because we're still losing to Southampton and then team a fucking set 2018 games in 2018. Like a wanker. It's like radio people. What the BBC tell us isn't what the new want us to believe. Then just think it up and, think about who benefits. Because at the bottom of everything is somebody benefiting from something somewhere. And there's one thing for sure. It fucking ain't me. And it ain't you. And it's up in the cat. 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 Now, what's them to sign out then, innit? You get a dog, or a wolf, or a spider, or a snake. How can you get a snake to be the same species as a dog? It's easy. You call the species that bites you. Weird. That bites you. Yeah. That bites you. Okay. Yeah, you've got a choice. Yeah. Yeah, you've got a choice. Yeah. Yeah, you've got a choice. Yeah, you've got a choice. But you want a punch in the face or a kick in the bollocks? Jesus. So what did you want to talk about? Bollocks. Yes, Jason bollocks. No bills of exchange. That's how much I'm interested in what you reckon. I mean, that's sort of molecule of intelligence when you see the leak. Exactly. All the thinking is, which one of us are you going to propose to this evening? A load of men who don't have sex. Yeah. Good evening and welcome to Raconteurs News this Monday evening. It's the 10th of June 2019. I won't say where does the time go, but we all know it just fucks off and disappears. I don't know where it's gone. I hope you've had a good weekend. Good evening to you all. I hope you've had a good weekend. It's pissing down here at the moment. It's actually, I think we're going to be dumped on by about a month's worth of rain in 24 hours, according to some media reports and some stuff that I saw posted on Facebook by Webby. Let's have a look. We'll just look in the chat room and say hello to the people already there. There you go. Hello, Billy, Stewie, Dave Iron, Alan McVicker. Good evening to you all, everybody there watching us. And I hope you've had a good weekend and you're feeling great and you're feeling strength and positivity. And it's really hard these days, isn't it? All this strength and positivity that we had seems to be being dragged out of us, and everyone seems to be becoming increasingly isolated and left on their own and to their own devices and isolated from people that are friends of theirs simply because of all this censorship that's going on at the moment. But I'm sure we'll get through it. Listen, I've got a great show for us tonight. I've got a great guest. He's a guy who is I met quite a long time ago. It must be 10 years ago now that I first met this guy. We've not actually ever met in person, I don't think, but we have spoken over many years sporadically. It's always good to get somebody on that you feel comfortable with. You know, Aidy's back next week, by the way, everybody. So I spoke to him this week, and he's still doing okay. I think he gets home Wednesday night. So Aidy will be back next week, but it's just me this week, and so I wanted somebody I felt comfortable with, somebody that I knew had great information, somebody that I had something in common with as well. So tonight's guest is Matt Sergio, Matt Conspiro. Good evening, Matt. How are you, my friend?
Hello. Yeah, good. I've got to admit, I feel a little bit nervous.
Don't feel nervous.
Because you said it, what a great show it's going to be, and I just hope it is going to be a great show. Because, yeah, I mean, I recall about a week ago when you put up the Facebook plug for this thing tonight, you said I've got a wealth of information. I think you just said it then, and that's the key, really. I think you just said it then. The key being I've got a really bad memory. So yeah, I do amass all this information, but at this precise moment, as I sit here now, I'm just wondering to myself if I'm going to be able to remember enough to be eloquent enough and interesting enough. And that always makes me a little bit nervous in these kind of situations, these kind of like quote unquote interviews or live chats and stuff. I haven't done a lot of them as a guest. I come from a media background, so I used to interview a lot of people, and I still do. I still do a little bit of radio, and I have interviewed, and I do interview a lot of people. But being on the other side of the chair, wow, that's something completely different, man. And yeah, I just hope I am. I hope. Wow, what a great show it's going to be. It's going to be, you know. But we'll see.
Listen, I'm sure it will be. Listen, there is. We're just having a bit of a chat. We're talking. I mean, we were talking beforehand, and I think that were broadcastable. I mean, we were talking. We're both from a DJing background, aren't we? So we were talking before about we're relatively the same age. I'm 49, and you're a little bit older 50. Than that. 50. Yeah. I didn't want to tell everybody, you know. Broadcast your age, but yeah, so you're 50, I'm 49, and we sort of, our DJing careers would have been run parallel, although miles and miles apart in terms of what sort of venues and things we were doing, and also geographically as well, because you're right down there in are you in Great Yarmouth?
East Coast, Norfolk East Coast, the seaside resort.
Yeah, and as we were saying, and we both, I would imagine you started at an early age. I started when I was 17, and I quit about 5 years ago. And it seems that you quit 5 years ago. And
that's pretty much in parallel. Yeah, it's pretty much in parallel. The first ever gig I did, and it wasn't a professional gig. It was just because I've been wanting to be a DJ on radio and stuff since I was about 10, 11. It's just something I used to sit at home. I'm sure you probably did pretty much the same thing. Pretend you were on the radio when you were about 10, 11, get little cassette recorders and pop them in the cassette machine with a little sort of one of those little tiny little £1.50 microphones, and pretend you were doing a radio show and put records on and stuff. And so from that age, I wanted to be a DJ, and I just consider myself to have been very, very lucky to have actually got to do it. And I think the first ever gig I ever did, proper gig, was when I was about 15. And it was for a village fete, but I only did like 10 minutes. I mean, there was a proper DJ. There was like a proper adult there, and I was just like, my parents knew the people that ran the holiday camp, and they said if there was any chance I could go on and do a little bit, and they said, yeah, I know, you can come on and do 5-10 minutes or whatever. So I went on and did 5-10 minutes. But yeah, I started properly a year later, 86, when I was. So I managed to wangle myself into nightclubs by lying about my age, telling them I was 18. When I was actually sort of 16 going on 17. And yeah, I was a club DJ, also on radio as well, up until about the same as you, 5 years ago. And then I just got out of it because the scene has completely changed, and not for the better. And I don't think it's because we're getting older. I just think it's changed. I think it's the people that have changed, and not in a good way.
It seems completely imploded. It seems to have completely imploded. The nightlife scene, you know, the nightlife, the DJ, you know, all that sort of industry. It seems to have really imploded. And I don't know whether it was the smoking ban that started it, or what it was that started it, but it did seem to completely just. We were just discussing beforehand. By the time we had had enough, it wasn't the fact that we were burnt out and we were knackered and we were, you know, not good at it anymore. It was the fact that the people were just completely changed. Like you said, when I first started, and I've got to just sort of admit something here, but I went into DJing for the birds, and because I didn't get, you know, you got a decent amount of money for doing very little work. And that's the reason I went into it. And I started off on holiday camps and stuff, and did clubs, but it just seemed to. I know things evolve and things, scenes become different, but I feel quite privileged to have been a DJ in a time where I think it was quite a golden age.
Oh yeah. I think we were very lucky. I mean, I know. Even, you know, when you can look back through your life and see people that are older than you, 20, 30 years older than you, and they'll say, they say to you, it's not like in my day. Oh, in my day, it was much better than this. I know every generation, as they get to a certain point of an age, as in our age, middle age, we say things like that. I know that's part of the thing, but I just think, yeah, there is that is true, but I also think, having been a DJ for over 30 years and having seen each generation come of age, become a teenager, go out to nightclubs, and then they leave, they go off and do their own thing, then another generation comes. I would have to say that there has never been, we were lucky to be in that era that we were in. I'll get onto the generation thing in a minute, but like you say, 86 up until 5 years ago, you said we've witnessed quite a lot of musical movements that are still with us today, that have become legendary. You know, you think of like the mid 80s, you had hip hop becoming popular. Hip hop had been around since the late 70s, mid to late 70s, but it wasn't until about 84, 85, 86 that hip hop began to become popular. You had bands like Eric B and Rakim, you had Run DMC, you had Full Force, you had all these great names, KRS-One. So there was that going on, which came off the 80s pop thing. That sort of burnt itself out. But you had the hip hop thing happen. Then you had the rave thing happen, which brought the explosion of house music. And then you had the indie thing going on. So there was always something going on, and you can look back on those days and say that they are now legendary. You listen to the radio now and you hear music from those times because there was good music around at that time, and I think we were part of something that was happening at that time, which was quite special. And I don't see that now. Maybe that is because we're getting older and we're not teenagers, so we're not in that scene anymore as such. We're not mixing with young people. But I don't tend to see anything going on at the moment in popular music that has got that kind of power, where in 20 or 30 years time we're going to be saying, oh yeah, do you remember listening to Taylor Swift or whatever, and looking back on it with such reverence. You know, I don't think we will be. I think a lot of popular music now is very throwaway. It's throwaway. It's not special. There's nothing special about it. It doesn't seem like it's got a long shelf life. And to this generational thing that I was on about, having been a DJ for 30 odd years, over 30 years, you see generations come when they're teenagers, they get older, they come to nightclubs, they go, then you see the next lot come in, then the next lot, then the next lot. And what made me leave, as I was saying to you before we hooked up on this live, what made me leave was the generation that had come up at the point where I said, that's enough. It was completely different in every way, shape or form I can imagine. For a start, back in the day, I used to play a lot of popular music, yeah, sure. But I could also get away with playing new music. And by that, I mean music that hadn't been released yet. I'd go into record shops, listen to tracks that hadn't been out yet, maybe on a white label, a promo copy. And I think, I like that. I'm going to try and play that and plug it and see if I can make it popular in the clubs where I'm working. And that's what I used to do. And what I found back in those days was you could do that. You could actually take a risk, have a busy dance floor, take a track that no one had ever heard before, take a risk and think, I believe in this track, I'm going to play it. And you would have people coming up to you after going, what was that? What was that track you just played? And they'd be asking for a notepad and pencil so they could write it down, get down to the record store and order it for when it came out. And you found that you were part of something, that you were creating a scene, that you were encouraging music, that you were not just making people happy on the dance floor, but you were actually creating something, doing your part in promoting new music. This last generation, when I said that's enough, had no stomach for that kind of thing. They just wanted to hear what the mainstream media, this is the way I see it, it's the only way I can see it, is I don't know what, it must be the mainstream media, the power that the mainstream media now has over the generation. The way the mainstream media has got more sophisticated in its ways of controlling people's perception, controlling people's taste, and making it feel as though that what people are picking is actually is their decision, when in actual fact it's not. It's just very good brainwashing techniques, propagandizing by the mainstream media, and they've managed to get it to a point where people are they're not interested in what you've got to play. I was trying to play new music that no one had ever heard before, and they were not interested. They just wanted to hear what they've been told to listen to, whether it be by the BBC or whether it be by one of the independent, commercial stations, or by the television. There was no hunger for anything new. They didn't want anything different. They like what I was saying earlier about we've been through these different scenes like hip hop and house music and the birth of all these different movements. I was in that. I witnessed it happen, and I could sense that there was a kind of an excitement going on within that generation for listening to new stuff. And I just didn't get that with this new generation that was coming up. They weren't interested. They just wanted to get the mainstream. That's what they wanted. They were not interested in hearing anything that they'd never heard before. And I just thought, for me, back then, being a man in his mid-40s, playing new music, I'm effectively old enough to be their dads, and I'm the one playing new music to them, and they're not interested. That's like a complete spin around. Shouldn't that be the other way round? Shouldn't they be saying to me, hey, granddad, why are you playing all this crap, this chart crap, this mainstream rubbish that we hear day in, day out, wherever we go? We can hear this in the nightclub next door. We can hear this on the radio. Why don't you play something new, old man? But it wasn't. It was the other way around, That's just one reason why I got out of it. I just got bored of playing the same crap over and over again because I didn't want to hear anything different. I just wanted. I could have been a jukebox, basically. I remember having a meltdown one night, and that was one of the points where I thought, right, I've got to retire now. I actually had a meltdown on the microphone. I picked the microphone up and I said, I've had enough of you fucking, treating me like a bloody jukebox. And no one said anything. No one reacted. It was like talking to a load of robots.
Yeah. That was one of my lines, actually. That people used to come up and I'd say, "Oh, I played that," or if he said, "Oh, I'm not playing that. I don't like it. I'm not playing that. It's crap," and they'd say, "Well, you're supposed to do what we're told. What you're told. Yeah. We are." I said, "Listen, I tell you what. I know more about." And this is me being a bit arrogant, but I'm in a club and some little so-and-so's just come up and asked me for a scooter or something ridiculous, and then told me that I have to play it because he's paying my wages and all that sort of shit. And I said, listen, I tell you what, right? I know more about what you want to hear than you do. Right, I know more about what you want to hear than you do. That is why I'm stood here and they're paying me 150 quid for a few hours work, and there's not a jukebox here because
there's a queue going outside the door, and there's a queue outside, people clamoring to get in.
It's that was one of my lines, and I know that seems a bit arrogant, but it just got you to that point. I also wanted to mention the point as well. You were talking about people not wanting to hear new music, and it took me back to back in when I first got my first club job. Was a club in Sheffield called Josephine's. Now it was legendary in. It was where all footballers went and all this sort of thing. And I got this job. I got a job there. I were 18. To be fair, there were two DJs, and he was the main DJ, and I was sort of did warm ups and all that sort of thing and all that. But we used to get records sent through. When you're talking about new music, we used to get records sent through, and there were one particular record that struck me, and I thought, oh, I really like that. I really like that. And I'll tell you what it were, because it didn't make it for till a couple of years after, and I think they'd rehashed it as well into, how they do. But it were Zoe, "Sunshine on a Rainy Day."
Oh yeah.
And I got hold of that, and I took that everywhere with me, and I used to play it everywhere, and people really liked it. And I like to think that I had some sort of input in getting it into the charts when it happened. But like you said, that just doesn't happen these days, does it? If it's what the repetitive thing that they've heard all day while they're at work. Probably, if they've got a radio on at work, they probably heard it all day at work. Why do they not want to go out and find something new, find something, discover something? It's a terrible generation we've got at the moment, isn't it?
It's indicative of the times. It really is. I mean, you look at the pop charts. Well, I don't actually. I say, as me saying, take a look. I don't anymore. So I used to study these things, but you just take a look at, that's indicative of what I'm trying to say. It's just bland. It's bland beyond belief, and I challenge, anyone in 30 years time to be able to look back at where we are now and to pick a compilation album and make a compilation of classics. It's just not gonna happen. There isn't a movement. There's nothing. There isn't anything going on. There's nothing. I mean, it's just, talking about generations. I mean, we just before we came on, we were talking about punters, people going to clubs and stuff. And you remember I was saying about you'd have girls coming in. Maybe they were on hen nights, I don't know, but just groups of girls. And I just remember this one group of girls coming in, sitting at a sofa, and they were paying absolutely no attention to the club whatsoever. They were just all looking at their phones, all of them. So what are they doing going out? They're not looking around at the environment, which they come out for, you'd assume. They're not listening to the music. They're not talking to each other. They're out as a group and they're not talking to each other. They're looking at their phones. So why are they out? Why have they come out? What are they doing there? Why are they sitting there making me angry by being so disinterested? Not only in me, but in themselves.
We're going to get on to, when you talk about generational thing, we're going to get on to our subject, the 60s, in a while, but it all links back, doesn't it? Do you think that this has been done on purpose, or do you think this is a byproduct of the way society has gone?
It's a byproduct. I don't know. I don't want to make any sort of concrete statements, but from what I observed, it seems to be a byproduct of something that's going on now. Whether it's got anything to do with the 60s or whether it's got anything to do with all these other social movements that took place, I don't know. But this is completely different to what was going on in the 60s. This is completely different to what was going on with the rave era, because I was around when that whole acid house thing was going on, and I can say with loads of confidence that people that were going out clubbing then were genuinely going out because, yeah, there was the drug element, but they also wanted the music as well, and they were interested in the music. Whereas now I don't see that. I don't see there being any interest at all in music. It's just people going out. And listening to the same music, listening to on the radio, like you say.
The drugs and the music went hand in hand. They complemented each other.
Yeah.
And I would imagine that during that time there was far less aggro on the streets when people have had a drug that's made them all happy and everything.
Yeah, certainly. I mean, there was a lot. There was the side thing which you could always. There was always that scummy element though. Like the dealer element, because it was the acid house scene. There was a lot of trips being sold and a lot of this and a lot of that. There was that scummy element that was there. You could see him in the club. So there was always a bit of that going on, but it wasn't like the nightclub thing on the high street where it was people getting tanked up and fighting on the street. So it wasn't that. But yeah, I mean, we're going to get, I hope we do get into the whole social engineering thing. And this is not me. It's weird because it's like I'm praising. It's like what I'm about to say is I'm praising musical movements. I'm not doing one or the other. All I want to do tonight, if possible, is just to give you information. I'm not here to give you a judgment. I've never been one for judging. I don't like to give. I like to look at facts and information and then get them all together. I like to see myself as a reporter more than anything. So I just take information and facts and bits and pieces, collect them together and then look at them, try to sift out the ones that look like there might be a little bit of bullshit going on, and then make it into an article or something or other, and then just post it up on one of my sites, and then just leave other people to make up their own mind. So what I'm about to say might sound like I'm praising some of these musical movements, but I'm not doing either. I'm not praising or putting it down or making judgments. That's for someone else to decide. Who am I to make judgments, you know? That's the way I see it. But when you look at the musical movements and the way things are now, for example, just to sort of illustrate what we've been talking about, I think, you look at the 1950s, you had 1957. It all seems to happen on the sevens and the sixes and the sevens. 1957, you had like the first real break in the sort of so-called modern era of what you call the teenager, breaking out of this middle-aged world that they'd always grown up into. So they'd go to school, they'd leave school, they'd get a job, they'd dress like their parents and they'd get a job, they'd retire and they'd die. You know, there wasn't like a youth movement. There wasn't this free movement of money for young people to spend. Then all of a sudden, in the 1950s, young people had money to spend. And partly as a result of that, I think, from what I've found, record companies, TV stations, fashion designers, and all these kinds of elements of the cultural media, if you like, culture, sort of capitalized on that. That's one way of looking at it. And the first time that sort of kind of began to happen was in the 50s. 1957, you had really the birth of rock and roll, which was the first real teen sort of movement. So you had Elvis, Jerry Lee Lewis, Little Richard, and so on, Chuck Berry. And then in 1967, you had the so-called Summer of Love, which was the hippie thing, which took hold, and everyone grew their hair long, wore bell bottoms, took acid, smoked dope, and got into that whole sort of completely different music scene. Then in 1977, you had punk, and then the offset of that was the new wave movement, which sort of went into new romanticism, and that took you into the early 80s. But essentially, that all came from punk in 1977. Interestingly enough, I don't know too much about this yet. I'm just going off onto a tangent. But if you look at 1977, and a lot of the people that were involved with the punk scene, like Malcolm McLaren, for example, his roots actually go back to the 1960s. He was actually hanging around with all the heads in the 60s. So it makes you wonder, you know, how we're told that punk was different to hippies. You know, it was punk was like the antithesis of the hippie movement. It was a symbolic smashing of the hippie scene. But when you actually look at it, Malcolm McLaren was very much part of that whole 60s thing. But anyway, so 77 you had punk, then 86 was the birth of house music in Chicago, and then it moved to Britain in 87, and in Britain it took on a whole new different sound, a whole new different thing, and it became acid house. So that was 87. And then 97, nothing. 2007, nothing. 2017, nothing. So 2017, that's just about the time that I gave up DJing. I'd gone through the last 7, if you like, which was the acid housing, and then there was nothing. I'd experienced that, and then so it's quite interesting that we've had nothing, no youth movement, if you like. I'm not saying that's a good thing or a bad thing, but is that a byproduct of what we witnessed, seeing towards the end of our DJing days, where young people don't seem as radical, they don't seem as rebellious, they don't seem where the older DJ, the middle-aged DJ, seems more radical than the actual people, the young people he's playing music to, because we're a product of that earlier era when all the hip hop was coming through and the house music, and we were kids when punk was happening as well. We would have been 7, 8, 9, 10 years old. That was going on, where we would have been involved with it, but it would have rubbed off on us in the music we were listening to and the things we were watching on TV, whether we wanted it to or not. So we're byproducts of that, whereas these kids are byproducts of those decades where nothing was going on, when there was nothing. Whether this is part of an agenda, twisting it, so we're part of something that was radical, whereas they're part of a different kind of radicalism, where there's nothing, the radicalism of nothing, of blandness, of smartphones, of maybe that is the new youth movement, smartphones. I don't know. I'm just my head is just like I'm just wondering what, you know, because I'm theorizing live on air. I don't have an answer, you know. I'm just trying to work out why there hasn't been anything in the last 30 years and whether it is a byproduct of what we've been talking about, you know.
Yeah, it could possibly be. Let's say hello to some people in the chat room. There's been a few people. I noticed somebody put a laughy smiley face next to Josephine's. Yeah, that I worked there. I was responsible for the stuff that was going on in Josephine's, and there are people that say that the favourite time is the 50s. We've had everybody, 50s, 60s, 70s. And even Ron, who's probably one of the more senior people in the chat room, he even liked 80s music, and he said that was the last time. But if what you're saying is true, or if there's any truth to it, then 87, the 80s was the last time that anything. Oh, sorry, we're not 96, weren't it? No, 80s.
Yeah, 80s. Yeah, nothing happened, and we had so-called Britpop in the mid-90s. I suppose you could try and, if you were being, you could try and say that was a kind of a movement. But that, I mean, the reason that we're here, I suppose, tonight is to talk about social engineering of different musical eras, and each one seems to have that. But Britpop to me seems like the most fake one of the lot. You know, I wouldn't class that as anything special, because Britpop to me, it didn't change anything. Do you know what I mean? It didn't change. It might have got people wearing different clothes, or buying Oasis records or Blur records or Pulp records or whatever, but it didn't actually change the face of culture, whereas the rock and roll movement certainly did, because it gave birth to it sort of inspired a lot of youngsters at the time to start their own bands and to get into music. So from that we got the Beatles and the Stones, and then that sort of movement that came in the 60s. And again, with the Summer of Love, that's huge, as we know. That just changed culture to an extent that we live in that result of that now. Punk, again, it changed things. The acid house thing certainly changed everything, you know, clothes, fashion, the ways that we go out clubbing now, and music as well. But the Britpop thing didn't change anything. To me, it felt a little bit forced. So yeah, I'd say 87 was the last really, really, really sort of lasting movement that actually had, lasting movement that left something behind that we still live in today, you know, the effects of, good or bad, you know.
And the Britpop thing as well. I mean, what you had, it were at a time where there was this like false dawn, as we know now, but there was this false awakening, and people were then realised that Tony Blair was going to be, you know, God and everything. And you got Oasis and people like bands like that. They were all fawning to them. So it did seem as though it had been created in order to try to bring younger people into the brand of politics that Tony Blair were displaying.
Yeah, I mean, it wasn't around that time that I think it was. It was just around the time he got voted in as prime minister for like the second time or maybe the first time. And when the Britpop thing was going on, then you see the shot of him walking into 10 Downing Street after he's been voted in as prime minister with a guitar case in his hand. You know what I mean? It's like, hey, I'm down with the kids, you know. And then he does that party, like you say, he hosts this massive party where he's got Noel Gallagher, I think it was Noel Gallagher, shaking hands with him, and he's got all these beautiful young people from the London scene of the mid to late 90s, you know, like Danny Boyle and all these people turning up to this great reception that he held for them. And yeah, it all seemed a bit false, and it was all hanging off this 60s thing. It was like a dregs of the 60s, you know. They had like Oasis versus Blur. Do you remember that?
Yeah.
when they both released songs at the same time, and it was like they were always pitted as like in the 60s, it was, who do you like? Do you like the Beatles, the clean-cut, mop-top, lovable Beatles, or do you like the dirty, lascivious Rolling Stones? And it just felt to me like that was the 90s Britpop thing, was like dragging all that up again, but with different faces, So you had Blur or Oasis. Which one do you like? The middle-class boys Blur, from the home counties, or is it going to be the Manx, these like rough and ready brothers, with their band of merry musicians, and which one are you going to buy? They both release their records on the same day or something, and which one's going to get to #1 the next week when the sales figures come out? Who are you going to support? And it's all 60s throwback, like Austin Powers and all that kind of stuff, the swinging 60s. It all just felt a bit like they were trying to drag something up. And there is an article up. It was an interview. I don't think it was in the Guardian or something. I can't remember the name of the guy. He's in a band, and he insinuated that, according to him, and I can't remember what band it was, a singer in a band that they never got huge, but they're quite a well-known indie band. They were around in the 90s, and he made the insinuation that he wouldn't be at all surprised if the whole Britpop thing was government born, if it was basically kind of a creation of the Blair government to sort of help him to get into power and to keep him there as well, and to make him look like a man of the people. I can't remember the band. I've got their records as well. I can't remember the guy's name, but there is an article. He had an interview with like one of the mainstream newspapers. I think it might have been the Guardian. I can't remember. It's on the web though. It's up there. I've seen it. I just can't remember his name. But yeah, and he's right in the middle of all this, and he's insinuating that maybe it was all sort of fabricated, to bring on this thing. But yeah, I don't count Britpop as anything that shaped anything. I don't think we should even be talking about it.
Well, it was sort of like
joke. It's like a joke,
It had a bit of mod in there, didn't it?
Yeah, a bit of mod, a bit of Beatles. There's a lot of Beatles actually. I mean, Oasis are always accused of being Beatles sound-alike. So then you had Blur, who actually began before all that. They began in the 80s, didn't they? And they got big in the 90s, and they released actually quite a good album. I like that album. The only album of theirs I like, which is just called Blur, and it's got a song on it called Beatle Bum. Yeah. And it sounds like something off the White Album, off the Beatles' White Album. But yeah, there was a lot of that going on then.
Nonsense, though, isn't it? I mean, then you got the comparisons. Noel Gallagher thought he was John Lennon, and
didn't he name his kid Lennon?
Sorry,
didn't Liam name one of his children Lennon?
Yeah,
I thought so.
A devout and staunch Manc, and he names his kid after a Scouser. Don't really fit in, does it?
Yeah.
It does fit into the narrative that we're talking about. So we've not really. Shall we touch on the Beatles? What we've spoke for a while, but we've not you've mentioned him in passing, but we've not spoke about the Beatles. I mean, this is what we were getting you on. We were going to be talking about the 60s and what have you. And it's I know you were a little bit nervous beforehand and thought that you might not have much to say, but it's clear that you've got tons and tons to say, because we've not even mentioned Beatles and we're 40 minutes in. So
yeah, I've got tons and tons to say, but is it all just a load of hot air? That's the that's the thing.
Well, you see, it doesn't matter because it's free, so it doesn't matter. It's free hot air in colour here on Raconteurs News, so you get free hot air in colour. But listen, I've been doing a few shows recently that one show to another, they've been quite confrontational. So I'm just glad to get back into just having a chat with somebody, or somebody I like, and somebody that's got interesting stuff to say. So the Beatles. I mean, what do we do? Where do we start? Is it Paul or is it Fall?
No, not that again. That's the one thing I really get nervous talking about for a number of reasons. We've talked about this before. Funnily enough, before we came on tonight, I went back and listened to the old Raconteurs chat we had about a year ago. And I was listening, and I didn't listen to the whole thing. I just randomly pressed play and then moved the fast forward rewind thing on the YouTube thing to just any old point, and it just happened to go onto the Paul is Dead bit where I was talking about that. I haven't really got much to add to that really, because I listened to that about a couple of hours before we came on now, and I haven't really got much to add to that. I get really nervous about talking about the Paul is Dead thing for so many reasons. First off, because it's a whole field of research in itself, and it's not my field of research. I do look into the Beatles, yeah, and I should just point out that I've been a Beatles fan since I was about, maybe it must have been since I was about 4 or 5 years old. And the reason for that is because my sister's 10 years older than me. So she was a teenager when I was about 5. And so she was at that age where she was buying a lot of records. And she had a record player there. And I was just this kid and I just found myself gravitating towards her record collection. I don't know what it was. I just loved playing records. So I'd be sifting through her record collection. And she had a really good collection, actually. She had a Space Oddity album, original album, David Bowie. And she left me all this stuff when she got married and moved away. She left me all this stuff when I was a kid. Thanks for that. It's brilliant. Slade, Far, Far Away, which was brilliant. But yeah, there was like these 3 Beatles albums there. One of them was the Help soundtrack, which was okay. But the 2 that I kept playing over and over and over and over and over and over again at that age was what they're called the Red and the Blue albums. And they're 2 double albums, came out in 1973, if I'm not mistaken. The Red album is basically a collection of their singles and a few album tracks, which are kind of termed like classics within the albums. So that was like the Red album was 62 to 66, and the Blue album was 67 to 70.
Is that the ones where they're looking over the balcony on the?
That's the one. Yeah, the ones where they're looking over the balcony in 19. There's a picture of them looking over an EMI building over a balcony in 1962, and you can tell it's really early because Ringo had just joined the band within a few days before or something, and he's still got his old teddy boy haircut in that picture. He hadn't been told to do the mop top to comb it down. He'd been in another band. He was a teddy boy, so he'd only been in the band a few days or maybe a week or a couple of weeks. So he's got his old Ted haircut in that picture. So that's a really early picture of the Beatles, just as they'd been signed to EMI, 62, 63. And you've got the picture of them on the Blue album of them in 1969. Very same balcony, but of them in 1969 with the long hair and the beards and all that kind of thing. So those were the 2 albums that I kept listening to over, and I can't explain what it is. Maybe it's nothing more, nothing less than the fact that they made good music, and I was just captivated by that music, and I just found myself at the age of 5 years old listening to this over and over and over and over, and I just got hooked into their music. And as I got older, because I was hooked into their music, then I started to follow them as well. You know, all right, they'd split up. They were no longer a band, a working band, but there'd be documentaries on the TV, and I'd watch those, or you know, I'd buy magazines or with their interviews in them or whatever. So I started to get into their story as well. So fast forward now to middle age, and yeah, I've been a fan all my life. You ask any friend of mine or member of my family, is it right Matthew likes the Beatles? And they'll say, oh God, don't start him off. God, does he like the Beatles? It's one of those. When it's my birthday, I'll get a Beatles mug or that kind of thing. It's that sort of notorious with me. So that's my background. Okay, so I feel that when I got into all this research thing from the beginning, which was about 10 years ago, when I started researching stuff and put together a website, it was mostly to do with the music scene as it was happening at that time. I did dip into the past and look at things that had happened 30 years before or whatever, but the aim of Conspiro Media, my blog, which is still going, but at the time when I started it, was to look at topical things that were going on. But as time has gone on, I just find that I feel more comfortable writing about the Beatles, you know, and when you look to check if there are, when I did 10 or so years ago, to see if, wait a minute, I'm getting into all this alternative research, into this, I've fed myself into this alternative research, and I'm looking at the world in a different way. I'm looking at the music industry. Let's look at the Beatles. That's the next natural thing you're going to do, isn't it? So I started looking at the Beatles, and I noticed there was a lot of occult things going on, conspiratorial things that possibly have been going on. So I got to the point where I thought, you know what? I'm going to dump all this topical stuff that I'm doing, and I'm just going to. And for the last 3 years, that's what I've been doing. I've started a website called The Occult Beatles, and I've just been looking into that side of occult research in terms of music and entertainment, if you want to call it that, because I feel like I can, because I've been following their music and their story since I was 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10 years old. I feel comfortable doing it. I feel like I've got some kind of authority to do it as well. I don't feel like I'm sort of jumping in on a bandwagon or anything like that. I feel comfortable, and I feel like I feel confident to do it. But having said that, back to the original point, when it comes to Paul is Dead, irrespective of how much you follow the Beatles and how much of their story you've researched, whether it's mainstream or alternative, when it comes to Paul is Dead, that is a completely different area of research. Anyone who looks into Paul is Dead, the names that spring up at the moment, the one that springs up my head straight away is Tina Foster of Plastic Macca blog. She is well known for her work into what they call PID. That's what she spends her time looking at. I don't. So I feel nervous talking about this subject for that very reason. I haven't looked into it.
We don't need to talk about the Paul is Dead. I'm sure you've got tons and tons of other stuff on the entire Beatles, other situations and conspiratorial things. Tell us about some of them.
Wow. Well, where do I start? There's so much. I mean, let me think. There was.
How did they get? Did they get were they put together, or were they just a band that were chosen out of somewhere? And were they managed? And I'm not talking about Brian Epstein, but managed by intelligence agencies from an early time, or were they at all even?
Well, there is this school of thought, and it's mainly to do with this guy called John Coleman, isn't it? Dr. John Coleman, who says he was a former intelligence officer. I don't know what he's a doctor of, by the way. If anyone can let us know, that'd be great. If anyone in the chat box knows, but he's this former intelligence officer who wrote a book, and which he mentions the Tavistock Institute and all these various other nefarious organisations, and it's from him that we get this idea. I think it comes from him mainly, that he made this claim in his book, that the Beatles were effectively created by the Tavistock Institute to become like this band of social engineers, basically to change youth culture. They were created and then put on the world stage to bring about a change in the way young people interacted with life. So to promote drug use, to basically give up on spirituality, to turn away from the church. And his contention was, his claim was, and what I find the difficulty with his claim is he's brought no proof to the table, is the Beatles were basically manufactured to bring about social engineering in the 60s through the youth generation, and their songs were written for them. They didn't write their songs were written for them by a member of the Frankfurt School, a musician and a philosopher and a speaker by the name of Theo Adorno. He wrote their songs. This elderly man wrote their songs right until they split in 1969, which, interestingly enough, is the year that Adorno died. I have a problem with that. Basically, my problem with that is there's a couple of problems with that for me personally. First off, apart from the fact that I know their story, the Beatles story, and I've heard demos of what they sounded like before they were famous, of them playing, going through songs when they were teenagers. All right, they're not the greatest songs in the world, but to me, it sounds like there's something going on there, that there's talent there. But irrespective of the fact that I've been looking into the Beatles story, and I'm aware, because, and we're aware of this now because of the Beatles anthology, which came out in the 90s, where it was 3 volumes of rare cuts and demos and all this kind of thing. And it coincided with the documentary that was released in the mid-90s, where the Beatles got together, the 3 remaining Beatles got together and made this documentary, this multi-part documentary where they told the story of the Beatles themselves. And to coincide with that came these 3 volumes of rare outtakes and stuff. And in the first volume, you've got tapes of the Beatles before they were the Beatles, as kids, with like little tape machines going through little rough versions of songs they've written when they were about 16, 17, 18 years old. All right, they're not the greatest songs in the world, but there is something there. You can hear something special, I think. Anyway, apart from that, Coleman makes this bold claim that the Beatles didn't write their songs, but he brings no proof. There is no proof. He has brought forward no proof, no anecdotal evidence, no documentation, nothing. It's just his word. So, okay, it's his word. The word of a former intelligence officer. So he told us. But you can look at that in 2 ways. You can look at that as in, that's great, he's a whistleblower and good luck to him. He's coming out and he's telling us something. But you could also look at it in the face of, well, he was paid to be a professional deceiver. That's what his job was. So is that what he's doing now? Is this? So that's my first. The second thing that I've got that doesn't quite ring true with me is he bases his theory around the fact that, I'm not going to quote him word for word in his book, but he says that the word teenager was brought into the psyche of the youngster by the Beatles. It was the Beatles that brought the word teenager into the psyche, and thus from teenager we get a new movement. So now these young people have got a tag, they've got a title that they can use as an umbrella in which to take drugs and to debase the family unit and to do all these things that this social engineering exercise that the Beatles were part of were alleged to be doing. So, but the fact of the matter is that the word teenager was not invented with the Beatles. The word teenager, from what I can make out, from what I've seen, and I've since learned that it actually goes back further than this. The word teenager was first actually used back in the mid-40s. I think it was 1947, 46, I might be wrong, and I think it was Life magazine or Time magazine was the first. They did a special piece about young people, and I can actually picture, you can find this on Google, the actual cover. It's a picture of a girl on the front, a teenage girl, and it says the age of the teenager, or the time of the teenager, I think. Some title like that, but that's the first time the word teenager, teen, and then dash age is used to introduce this new kind of movement, if you like. The next time it gets used quite a lot in music is during the rock and roll era of 56, 57. You had not Buddy Holly, it was Rock Around the Clock, Bill Haley and the Comets. Bill Haley and the Comets released a song, and the B-side on the 7-inch was a song with, I can't remember the name of the title, but it had the word teenage in it, teenager. So you also had a package tour that was going on at the time, and not Bill Haley, I think it was Buddy Holly, yeah. Buddy Holly was part of this package tour, this live package tour that was going around the States with a load of different other rock and roll acts, and it was called the Teenagers Tour or something like that. So the word teenager was in the teen consciousness way before the Beatles went to America, which is what Coleman's claim is. The Beatles went to America in 1964, part of the British invasion, and took the word teenager and put it into the psyche of the nation's youth. Well, no, that had happened like in 1956, 57, and it had happened 10 years before then in this Time Life article, this magazine, where they introduced the word teenager. So I've got issues. Okay, I've got issues with Coleman. Not to say that the Beatles weren't involved in social engineering, but I would suggest, and again, going back to what I said earlier about not wanting to make judgments and to concrete judgments, I'm just putting it out there as information and then just leaving anyone else to make up their own mind. That is not to say that the Beatles were not part of a social engineering exercise in which they were duped at some point, and then they realised what was going on and they turned away from it, i.e. John Lennon, who ended up, perhaps from turning his back on it, ended up getting shot for it. But yeah, we can go into, I've got a couple of ideas of how the Beatles might have been duped or otherwise into certain parts of social engineering that went on in the 60s, yeah, for sure. But I don't think that Dr. quote unquote John Coleman and his theory of the Beatles and Theo Adorno is the actual thing that happened. But having said that, here's a thought. Theo Adorno, and this is where I'm saying that there could be other ways in which the Beatles were involved in a social engineering exercise, which involved Theo Adorno. Well, yeah, I've got some thoughts on that. I don't know if you want me to expand on that.
I think we're going to do that in the second hour, because it's fascinating. Sorry, I'm just doing some. It's fascinating listening to you, Matt. I always knew that you were going to be like, you know, there's people in chat room who are looking at this and saying you should be on Mastermind or you should do it. All these sort of things. Everybody's really enamored with what you've got to say. So getting into the ways that you thought that the Beatles were used in social engineering is going to be fascinating, but we're going to do that in the second hour. So we're just going to have a quick break and play a record. So if you need to go and get yourself a wee or something, or a cup of coffee or anything like that, and then we'll get into the ways the Beatles were used in social engineering in the second hour, and various other things as well. It's been fascinating so far. I hope you're enjoying it, everybody. Raconteurs News. It's Monday night. It's the 10th of June in 2019. I'm going to play a record and then we shall be back. If you could just mute your mic, Matt, that would be awesome. And then we'll be back just after this record. This is Heath. I've got two here. I'm going to play this one. I am a 1 in 10, a number on a list. I am a 1 in 10, even though I don't exist. Nobody knows me, but I'm always there. Statistical reminder of a world that doesn't care. Walking malnutrition dulls my hair. My eyes are black and lifeless with an unprivileged stare. I'm the beggar on the corner, will no one spare a dime. I'm the child that never learned to read, cause no one spared the time. I am a 1 in 10, a number on a list. I am a 1 in 10, even though I don't exist. Nobody knows me, but I'm always there. Statistical reminder of a world that doesn't care. The victim, I'm the license to a gun. I'm a sad, bruised old lady in an alley or in a slum. I'm a middle-aged businessman with chronic heart disease. I'm another teenage suicide in a street that has no trees. I am a 1 in 10, a number on a list. I am a 1 in 10, even though I don't exist. Nobody knows me, but I'm always there. Statistical reminder of a world
world that doesn't care. Starving third world mother, refugee without a home. I'm a housewife hooked on Valium, a pensioner alone. I'm a cancer-ridden specter, discovering the earth. I'm another hungry baby, I'm an accident at birth. I am a 1 in 10, a number on a list. I am a 1 in 10, even though I don't exist. Nobody knows me, but I'm always there. Statistical reminder of a world that doesn't care. I am a 1 in 10, a number on a list. I am a 1 in 10, even though I don't exist. Nobody knows me, but I'm always there. Statistical reminder of a world that doesn't care. I am a 1 in 10, a number on a list. I am a 1 in 10, even though I don't exist. Nobody knows me, but I'm always there. Statistical reminder of a world that doesn't care.
Thank you very much. Welcome back to Raconteurs News. That's Heath Dweth, my best mate, and that's a cover version of 1 in 10, and I absolutely love it. And being here in Sheffield and with all the 5G that's going on, and they're cutting the trees down and everything, I find the line "I'm another teenage suicide on a street that has no trees" quite poignant, because that's what will happen with this 5G. It's just going to encourage people to be more and more online, and they're getting faster and faster stuff, and we're just losing our humanity. We are losing it. So grab it back. This is where you're going to grab it back. Your humanity, proper people, proper talking about proper stuff. This is what Raconteurs. That should be what my new logo should be on Raconteurs News. Instead of Untwisted, Unsweetened, which Andy came up with, or well, I believe anyway. It could be what did I say? Proper. I forgot what I said. I forgot what it is that I said. Oh dear me. Anyway, I hope you're having a good time in the chat room. Keep it civil in there. Thank you very much. I know we've got some good. We've got some good mods in there. I start reading stuff and then I lose where I am. Anyway, we've got Matt Sergio with me this evening. He is there. He is. He's waving to us. Did you have a good was there? Did you? Matt,
yeah.
Did you use the time wisely?
Yeah. Did you?
Yes, I did. Yes, I went and give my wife a kiss because I think she's going to be going to bed before the end of the show. So I did use my time wisely.
You'll fall asleep listening to me, you mean?
Look, she's got a very stressful job, so she's got a headache. So
yeah, from listening to me, probably like my wife. Oh, you're not wrong about the Beatles again, are you? Oh, blooming heck, here we go. Good night. Tomorrow.
That's my missus all the time, but it's about any subject, not just Beatles. Every time I talk about I can see her eyes glazing over as I see something innocent on TV, and I went, you know what that is, yeah. So I know the feeling. So let's get back into the Beatles. Social engineering, the 60s. Give us some ideas about what you're thinking about how the Beatles fit into that, and also the wider issue, because I know that you've done a lot of research on stuff that happened in America in the 60s and also here in the UK. How do they compare?
Well, how do the 60s counterculture in America and England compare?
Yeah, how do they compare, and what are the similarities and what are the differences?
Wow, that's a big question, man.
I've got an hour to fill.
Okay. I do tend to go off on tangents, though. All right, then. Well, what is the difference? Well, the difference being, what with it being America, the movement in America was a lot bigger. It's a hell of a lot bigger. And I've got to just say at this point that I'm talking from the standpoint of someone who was born in 1969. So I never lived in any of this, you know, pretty much. I didn't experience it. So it's really difficult. I don't know if it's difficult. It just, sometimes I feel a little bit uneasy about talking about how people would have felt in those times and what things were like in those times, having not lived in it myself. So I have to go through historical data, as we all do, to kind of get a good understanding of it. So with that said, yeah, America, it was just a lot bigger in America because it's a bigger country. In England, the countercultural scene, which was huge in terms of its influence, and I think that's something that I'm trying to address now, because I don't think it has been addressed in any way that is satisfactory to me. Even though it was the British scene was a huge influence on the so-called Western society, it was a lot smaller in England. The whole sort of counterculture scene, and when we talk about the counterculture, we're talking about it, for want of a better phrase, like the hippie era. You know, sort of the summer of love, this long summer of love that began kind of like in late 1966. And sort of went on till about 1969, when it got really ugly with a few things that went on, like the Manson murders and the Altamont Festival with the Rolling Stones, where the guy got stabbed to death in front of the Rolling Stones as they played. That's when it started to get ugly. But yeah, the scene, the counterculture scene, is basically an alternative way of living. That's what it was. It was LSD, which opened up the mind, and it made people see things in a different way. They never came back from that experience the same. A lot of people didn't come back from that experience the same. They saw the world in a different way. So it changed fashion. It changed the way music was recorded. We started to hear a lot of like sound effects in music, and it got trippier. Music sounded trippier. Everything changed. Alternative lifestyles began to be embraced. So that's what the counterculture is in a very, very short nutshell, very small nutshell. Whereas, as I say, in America, it was massive compared to England. In England, it was mostly centered in London. That's where the counterculture in England really was. The more sort of out of London you went, the less and less you saw of it. So if you wanted to experience the so-called counterculture in Britain, you had to go to London, because that's where all the nightclubs were. That's where all the fashionable clothes shops were. That's where the record companies were. That's where the bands played, mostly. That's where the nightclubs were. Everything was happening there. And the more out of London you went, the less of it you saw. Not to say that it wasn't going on. People were tripping their nuts off, you know, in various places around the country. But the hub, the activity was going on in London. So that's the difference. But to sell Britain short is, I don't think Britain's been sold short in terms of how it's been explained in history to do with the counterculture, but it hasn't been given its space to be shown what it did do. It hasn't been given a platform in terms of documentaries or books or commentary, and that's both in the MSM mainstream and also in the alternative field as well. It's mostly centered on America. And what I'm trying to do at the moment is to address that. And I was kind of influenced into doing that pretty much by Dave McGowan and his book about Laurel Canyon. Do you need me to explain the Laurel Canyon thing? I suppose most people, yeah, most people kind of get where I'm going with that. You know, when I read the book and heard him talking in interviews, I just thought to myself, well, if the counterculture was this social engineering exercise, and it was going on, and his research was mostly about America and about this Laurel Canyon scene in LA. Well, if that was going on in LA, this countercultural scene took over the Western world. You know, it didn't just happen in America; it happened all over Europe, and it happened in Britain, of course. So if it was going on, if what Dave McGowan has found was going on in LA, in order for this social engineering exercise to work, it had to have happened in Britain as well, because Britain was a key part of the counterculture. If it was going on in LA, as Dave McGowan found, it must have been going on in Britain. So that's where I've kind of like picked up the baton, if you like, and I'm just trying, in my own humble way, to look into that. And that's what I've been doing for the last 2 or 3 years now. I haven't actually put anything into print. I haven't actually gone into it in any great detail in any articles. I've kind of hinted at certain bits I found out in articles I've put up on my Occult Beatles site, and I've talked about some of it in podcasts I've done over the last year or so, last couple of years, but I haven't really gone into it and in any major form in an article or in a book or anything like that. And mostly the reason for that is because it's a huge project. This is going to take years, and I don't even know if I'm going to ever get to finish it, to be honest, because it's massive. Because first off, I want to understand the 60s scene before I do anything. I want to understand what that was about. Why did this counterculture come into force? What influenced people to get attracted to it? And then once I've done that, I have to find out who the movers and the shakers were. So this means essentially reading a lot of books, watching a lot of documentaries, watching a lot of interviews that I can find, whether it's on TV or on YouTube or whatever, buying DVDs, whatever I can do, and just reading all this stuff, mostly first-hand books as well, from people that were actually there, written by the key movers and shakers, and then just collating all this information together, getting it all down, filed away somewhere. And then the next process after that, which I'm in the middle of now and have been for the last couple of years, after I've done that, then I've got to sift through all this information I've found to sort out the wheat from the chaff, if you like. And then maybe, I don't know, a book. I don't know what I'm going to do, but that's where I'm at the moment with the whole 60s thing. But the Beatles thing is an ongoing thing. I just do that anyway, because I'm more comfortable with that subject. I can just do it off the top of my head. So yeah, if you look on my Occult Beatles blog, you'll find that it's regularly updated. But yeah, I mean, going back to Theo Adorno, and let me just say, you know, back to Dr. John Coleman. I don't want, you know, where he states that the Beatles came to do this British invasion of 1964. Basically, the British invasion was when the Beatles came to America in 1964, landed at JFK Airport, which in itself, you know, just a few months after JFK was assassinated, you've got the Beatles landing at JFK Airport, which in itself is quite symbolic. I'm not saying that this British invasion, which started with the Beatles and then all these other British bands coming in after them and sweeping the American charts, which was unheard of up until that time. British bands were a joke. British music was a joke in America. And now they were taking over America, which was the biggest market in the world for popular music. And if you could get hold of that, then you had the world as your stage, effectively, because it was the center of the musical universe in terms of popular music. So the Beatles, yeah, so that's why it's called the British invasion. So looking at it from that perspective, I can see where I can understand what Dr. John Coleman was saying in that respect, that it wasn't just an invasion in terms of sales, in terms of popularity. It was an invasion. It was an invasion of the British coming to America to begin this social engineering exercise, to turn on the young people of America onto what the British had already been turned on to with the Beatles, and this change in attitude from the stuffy 1950s sort of post-war era, when everything, from what I've gathered from people that I know that lived through that era in London, have told me it was a foggy place, it was black and white, there were still bomb sites everywhere from the war, we were still living on rations up until the mid to late 50s, weren't we? We were still living in a World War II world, and then along came the Beatles and this 1960s movement. You know, just everything went, and another thing that I've heard from people who lived in that time was when the Beatles came along and all these bands in their wake, it's like everything went technicolor, you know, from black and white and bomb sites and rationing to you know, swinging 60s, swinging London, everything was Technicolor, everything was the mini skirt and that whole kind of thing, Mary Quant and Carnaby Street. And so there was this, so the Beatles were taking that change in culture, youth culture, which is essentially where it made most of its effect. They were taking that to America and bringing it to America. So in that respect, it was an invasion. So if you're looking at social engineering, then yes, the Beatles were bringing about a social change. Whether you look at it from an alternative point of view or a mainstream point of view, they were bringing social change by landing at that airport. And it came, as a lot of commentators have said, it came after JFK's assassination, and a lot of mainstream pundits have said that the reason that happened, that the Beatles, why did this British band, you know, why would the Americans be interested in a British band? You know, they've got everything. America's got everything. It's got its own music industry. It's got its own culture. It's got its fashion. It's got everything. Why would it be bothered? Why would it care about the Beatles? These four guys from Liverpool. Why would they care? They've got their own thing going on. And you know, if you look at the mainstream, you've got pundits that say that the reason this happened was because everyone was mourning the death of Kennedy, and the Beatles seemed like this. They were quite down to earth guys. You know, they were stars, they were celebrities, but they were quite new in that respect, in that they didn't act like stars and celebrities. They acted like, they looked like down to earth people. They spoke like down to earth people, and that's quite unusual for famous people at that time to be like that. So there was this refreshing kind of air about them, and they were funny, and they were different, and it kind of lifted the spirits of America, and they took the Beatles to their heart. But it's also symbolic that with Kennedy, you've got, with Kennedy's death, some people would say that you've got this, with Kennedy's death, you had the military industrial complex speeding up, because he wanted to smash the CIA into 1,000 pieces. I think that was his quote. He wanted to get rid of the Federal Reserve. He wanted to take us back to a different kind of finance. So there was all this stuff that he represented, and that was like cancelled out as soon as he was killed. And then right after he's killed in November, the 22nd, which was the date of the release of the Beatles' second album with the Beatles, that's the date that their second album was released. And then from that moment onwards, you've got the speeding up with LBJ, Lyndon B. Johnson, taking on as president, taking over as president. We have the military-industrial complex beginning to accelerate again. We've got the Vietnam War beginning to accelerate. It began when Kennedy was a president. There was troops in Vietnam, but it was after his death that the troop numbers went up, and that's when it became an actual war, if you like, a conflict. So there was all this going on, and then you've got the Beatles landing, these social, if you're looking at it from a conspiratorial point of view, so you've got that going on, the Beatles releasing their album on the day of JFK's death, the symbolic day of the killing of this new, possible, better way of living. And then you've got the Beatles with a British invasion, and they land at JFK Airport, as I said earlier. So again, you've got this symbolic thing where it's almost like they're telling you what's going to happen. It's like, he's gone, we're here, and we're gonna take this now to, we're sort of gonna begin this social engineering exercise. So I can see where John Coleman is going with that. But as I say, I do have issues with this whole Theo Adorno thing. But that is not to say that Theo Adorno didn't have anything to do with the Beatles and in some kind of social engineering. And this takes us again to the counterculture, which took place in 65, 66, because before 65, the 60s was different. It's what you call the swinging 60s, if you like. There's two eras of the 60s. You've got like pre-66, late 66, kind of 65, where it's like the swinging 60s. It's a different kind of 1960s. But then late 65 into 66, LSD seeps into the culture, and then bang, everything changes. Fashion changes, as I said, music changed, everything changed. So you've got the counterculture, which is the second half of the 60s, and you've got the swinging 60s, and the Beatles were part of both. But what I think happened was, I don't think this is what happened. This is just another way of looking at it, all right? okay, let's say that Theo Adorno did have something to do with the Beatles in some kind of social engineering exercise. Forget this writing, he wrote their songs, right? Let's forget that. Let's look at Theo Adorno's standpoint from the counterculture. And as I said before, the counterculture was that counterculture would never have happened without the avant-garde, which, and again, how do you explain the avant-garde? Avant-garde is like modern art. It's another term for modern art. That's not the real term, but it's just, I'm trying to find a simple enough term to put it in a nutshell.
Should we call it tossabate?
Sorry?
Should we just call it tossabate?
Tossabate, yeah. I think it was one of the Beatles that said avant-garde, isn't that French for bullshit?
Yeah.
Funnily enough, I've been getting into a little bit of the history of the avant-garde, and not from a 20th century point of view, but from where it began, and actually it is a French word. And it began from around the time, I mean, I think we've always had an avant-garde of one shape or another, which is basically, avant-garde is kind of like an alternative lifestyle. That's what it, and Napoleon, during the Napoleonic period, he set up this like an avant-garde movement, which is where he encouraged people, artists of whatever ilk, to congregate, and artists who were less interested in monetary kind of gain or fame and were more interested in art. So it was like, avant-garde is like an alternative lifestyle. And when you look at the counterculture, that's what the counterculture in the 60s was. It was an alternative lifestyle. And without the avant-garde, you would not have had, I don't think there would have been a counterculture. I think the avant-garde movement, whether it be in painting, sculpture, music, film, poetry, books, writing, whatever, journalism, without the avant-garde, you would not have had a 1960s counterculture. It just would not have happened. You would have needed the LSD, obviously, but without the avant-garde, it wouldn't have happened. Because when you look, when you scrape away and keep going, keep scraping and keep scraping and keep scraping, get all the top layers off, all the sort of the floss, and you get to the bottom of it. It's the avant-garde that were sort of like the mainstay of it, the foundation, and the people that actually really kicked it off the ground and made it something. So looking at it from that perspective, Theo Adorno was avant-garde. He came from the avant-garde background. Avant-garde, from a musical background, the avant-garde music background. Avant-garde music is a bit like modern art. That's a good way of explaining it, I think, kind of like trying to give it a good definition. Modern art, if you think of modern art, it's like, well, you know what modern art is like. It's like weird shit, isn't it?
Crap, yeah.
It's crap. Some people would say it's weird shit, crap. That's what avant-garde music is. Avant-garde music is the musical version of modern art. It's just musical crap. For example, very, very well-known avant-garde musician, is hailed as probably the godfather, is John Cage. I think he was born in New York, and he died about 10, 20 years ago now. And one of his pieces was something called 4:33, 4 minutes 33, that's what it was called. Essentially what 4:33 is it's a performance. So a lot of avant-garde music isn't really recording. The pieces can be recorded, but they're essentially made for live performance. So the way I read about this, I read an account of this 4:33 and what it was. And this will give you an idea of what avant-garde music is about and the world that Theo Adorno actually comes from. John Cage, there's a recollection of this concert that took place, an open-air concert, and John Cage was going to come on stage and perform 4:33. So he comes on stage. I don't think it was John Cage that actually came on stage. I think it was a pianist that was going to perform this piece that John Cage had, quote unquote, written. So he comes on, and the way it's explained is he comes on wearing like one of those dinner suits, like a penguin suit, you know, with the long bit at the back, the bow tie, the whole thing. And there's a grand piano on the stage, and he sits behind the grand piano, and he sits there for about 20, 30 seconds. Nothing much going on apart from that, just sitting behind it, looking at the piano. The audience are watching. This is all new to them. This is something completely different. He lifts up the lid of the piano, puts it back down again, sits around a little bit more, lifts it up, puts it back down again, and that's essentially what the 433 is. He got up off the stool, I presume took a bow to the audience, and then walked off, leaving the audience just wondering what the hell was that all about. That was 433. Essentially, when people spoke about it afterwards, the journalists, people were saying to the journalists, well, what the hell was that all about? And what they were told was, well, that's music. What? That was, so imagine it, you're sitting in an open air concert, you've got this 4 minutes of silence, so you can hear birds tweeting in the sky, or somebody in the audience might be rustling a piece of sweet wrapper or coughing, or that's the music. This is what 433 is all about. It's what's going on around you. This is the music. So essentially, that's in a nutshell. It's a very small nutshell, yeah, I know. I'm being very general here, but that's what avant-garde music is all about. Another avant-garde piece was by Karl-Heinz, I think that's his name, Stockhausen, another so-called godfather of the avant-garde. I think it was Stockhausen. It might have been John Cage. I can't remember now, but it was his piece was about radio tuning. It was just a couple of minutes of a radio being tuned, and that was it. So this is the world that Theo Adorno comes from, right? He's not just this. He's not a doddery old man who sits there writing "She Loves You," yeah, for Beatles. This is the world that he comes from. He does not come from this traditional pop structure, from the traditional musical world. Avant-garde is a tonal music. And tonal, essentially, off the top of my head, a tonal means music without melody or essential structure. So it's kind of random music. So there's no verse, chorus, verse, chorus, verse, chorus melody. It's a tonal. It doesn't have melody. It doesn't have what you would call a good tune. What you and I might call a good tune. It's not a good tune. It's a radio tuning. It's another piece, I think was by Stockhausen, again I might be wrong, was the sound of helicopter rotor blades going around. And the actual performance is two helicopters, I think, going up in the sky. It's a live performance. You have to do it live with rotor blades, and they record the rotor blades. And that's okay. So that's avant-garde, a tonal. So that's where we're going with this, okay? So sometime after the Second World War, when Germany was taken over by the Allied forces, so we're talking about Britain and America, when they took over Germany, essentially what they did was they shut down all the radio stations, they closed down all the theatres, anything to do with anything that they said, according to the official version of accounts, the reason they did this was to shut down any kind of media, music that was to do with Nazi Germany. This was called denazification. They were denazifying Germany. So they were shutting down all these places where you could hear maybe Wagner, this kind of thing. They were closing that down. They took over the radio stations. They took over control of all the theatres. And essentially they moved in and put in their own forms of theatre and radio and music. And this was all funded by the American military, also by the intelligence services as well. And one of the what they were doing, this was also around the time the so-called Cold War was coming into effect as well. So what they were doing was this denazification eventually kind of branched out into what was called the Congress of Cultural Freedom, the CCF, which was this movement, this organization, which was funded by the CIA, It was also funded by the American government, obviously, because the CIA was involved, but also the American military was involved. The British military was also involved to some extent. There was a British version of this. And what they did was, during the so-called Cold War, they moved into Berlin, they moved into Germany, and they opened up. What they were doing was they were propagandizing American culture, if you can call it that. So they'd open up exhibitions and museums where they do things like exhibit the Cadillac, you know, to show the Europeans the American way of life. You know, look, here's a Cadillac. This is what Americans drive. Here's rock and roll. This is what Americans listen to. They take over musicians, jazz musicians from America to play in Europe, all around Europe. I think it was Louis Armstrong was one of the people that was effectively paid by the military and the CIA to go over and to play in Eastern European countries that were at risk of being taken over by the influence of the Soviets during the Cold War. Yeah. So they'd send over Louis Armstrong, Nina Simone, I think was another one they sent over to do concerts in all these places that looked dicey, looked like they might go over to communist control, places like Greece, Poland, places like this. So that's what they were doing. And another initiative that the Americans started at this time in Germany was this, I can't pronounce it, it's a German school. It's called the Darmstadt School. It's actually, like I say, it's actually got a name, and I can't pronounce the name, but for want of argument, it's actually called the Darmstadt School. If you look on the internet, you can find it. It's called the Darmstadt School, and it was the reason it's called that is because it was based, and it is still there. It was formed in Darmstadt, and basically it's this summer camp which is held twice a year. And what was going on there was all the avant-garde musicians who up until that time didn't have much of a place to go and
do fuck all.
Were actually given money to go to this place, which was funded by the CIA and the American military. It was like a summer camp. So basically all these avant-garde musicians would meet there twice a year. They'd have seminars there. They play some of their new creations. They'd have lectures, debates, this kind of thing. And I think that started around the late 40s, early 50s. And this was part of this initiative. This was part of the CIA initiative to the official version of why they were doing this in Europe. The Americans were doing this in Europe with this Darmstadt School and all this stuff and promoting the avant-garde. The official version is because they were trying to show that the Americans were more open to new forms of art, whereas the Russians weren't. So they were open to having like this John Cage 433. They were open to having this kind of music. They weren't closed off. They weren't snobs. They weren't fuddy-duddy. The Americans were forward-thinking people. And so this was the reason why they came up with these. They came up with these initiatives. That was their argument. They were showing that they were better. They were more open-minded than the Russians. And this was all done through the Congress of Cultural Freedom, as I say. So you had this Darmstadt School, and you had a lot of regulars going there. John Cage was one of them. Karlheinz Stockhausen was another one. And another one was Theo Adorno. So you've got Theo Adorno going to this CIA-funded summer camp twice a year, or whenever he went. And I came across a quote from another avant-garde musician who used to go to these Darmstadt schools back in the day. His name is Konrad Burmer. And he, in an interview, he more than insinuated that Theo Adorno, to kind of paraphrase his quote, he said, wherever Theo Adorno went, the CIA and John Cage were not far behind. So, but that was as far as the interview went. The interviewer didn't take it any further than that, which is really infuriating.
Yeah.
So he didn't say, you know, the interviewer didn't ask him why do you think that. But anyway, that was his insinuation, is that Theo Adorno was this CIA stooge basically, and so was John Cage. Anyway, so thing is, in the 1960s, when you take in we've also got to, this is all documented, by the way, not the Theo Adorno CIA, but all this stuff about Darmstadt School and the Congress of Cultural Freedom. All of this has been documented and proven now. There's an author by the name of Frances Stone Saunders, and she wrote a book, which I can't remember the name of. I've got it behind me, actually. It's here. And she wrote about all this, and she got all the documents to prove that this actually happened. And I should just point out that it's also since come to light in the last few years that the modern art movement was CIA funded. Artists like Jackson Pollock, for example, was funded by the CIA. Whether he knew it or not is another matter. But I've got the book here. I know I've got it. Yeah, here we go. I don't know if it's going to come out in reverse. Who Paid the Piper? Yeah, the CIA and the Cultural Cold War. Frances Stone Saunders. So yeah, so it's all been proven that this was all going on. So what I'm suggesting is, when you take Theo Adorno and the avant-garde movement, then you take it to the 1960s and the counterculture. In what was going on before the counterculture really took off in 1966, and the whole hippie thing came from it, there were a few people hanging around in London in the early 60s that wanted this avant-garde, that were very much part of this avant-garde movement. Maybe not personally involved with the Darmstadt School, but they were fans of avant-garde art. They were practitioners of it, or they were fans of it. One of those, and their aim, and they've said this, was to change the world. And they all became very, very friendly with the Beatles. Some of them almost like family. And my contention is that they maybe duped certain members of the Beatles into the avant-garde, or they were part of the whole thing and it was all deliberate. So just before I go into that, just remember that the Beatles were very, very important to the counterculture. When you look at 1967, you've got the Sgt. Pepper album, which came out in right slap bang in the middle, June 1967, of the so-called Summer of Love. It has since been described as the soundtrack of that era. So it crossed over into the Atlantic. It went to America. It became the soundtrack of that movement, because the Beatles were the biggest band in the world. So this is what I was saying before about how Britain is important to this countercultural movement, because they were the biggest band in the world, and they did embrace the countercultural movement, and they put it on the world platform. And without America, and you can talk about America as much as you like, if the Beatles hadn't have embraced it and become flag wave bearers for it, would it have become as big as it did? You know. So thinking of that, going back again to what I was talking about earlier, the early 60s, with these certain individuals who wanted to change the world. One of them was a man by the name of Barry Miles. Barry Miles was very much a key player and mover and shaker in the counterculture of London. And you'll have to pardon me for pausing and stuff, but this is a huge, huge episode in history, and I want to get this as right as I possibly can. Barry Miles was the thing is, you don't know a lot about Barry Miles, his early life. Even in his autobiography, he starts the story from when he was about the age of 17. You know, nothing about, you know, where he came from, or what got him to where he got to. But he was into the avant-garde. He got into the beat poet, the beatnik scene. Again, the beat poetry scene of the 50s, Jack Kerouac, Allen Ginsberg, William Burroughs, all these people that were around in the 50s that were writing beat poetry. They were very much influential on people that were teenagers at the time, even though these beat poets were in their 30s, late 20s into their 30s. They were very influential on a certain amount of the youth. around at that time who were inspired by these people's poetry, this beat poetry, and they took it on. And that's where the avant-garde movement kind of grew from, because these people that were inspired by it got into avant-garde art. So if you want to look at where the counterculture of the 60s come from, you have to look at the beat poetry scene, which, again, just to explain, the beat poetry scene was this, it was a new way of writing. Beat poetry, it was like jazzy, you know, it's like poetry, but not like Wordsworth or something like this. I sit on a lonely cloud and all this kind of stuff. It was all, it was like, hey man, you know, yeah. And I dropped out of my car and I saw this crazy cool chick, and she's like, it was all this kind of thing. It was by these trendy kind of like Jack Kerouac, all these authors that were like looking for an alternative lifestyle. They were kind of shunning the 1950s kind of scene. They like in 50s America, it was all becoming very in 50s America, you had like consumerism, didn't you? Like everyone had to have 2.4, you know, kids, the house in the suburbs, the fridge freezer, the Cadillac, yeah, all that kind of thing. So they were kind of reacting against that. These were the beats, man. You know, it's like, hey, who wants to be stuck with these squares, man? Hey, we want an alternative lifestyle. We want to smoke dope, and we want to change the course of music. We want to get into jazz music. We want to like change art, bring in modern art, and that was where the avant-garde, this generation of people in the 60s that were in their 20s in the 60s were inspired by the beat. I mean, we could get into the beat, but that's another completely different, because if you look at some of the people that were involved in the beat poetry scene, like Allen Ginsberg, paedophile supporter, he eventually became one of the godfathers of the counterculture. The others didn't, like Kerouac couldn't stand them, apparently. But yeah, you could get into all of that and to see what social engineering things were going on there. But for now, just to concentrate on this. So yeah, so you had these people that were influenced by this beat poetry scene, the beat scene, and took the ethos of that, this alternative lifestyle, and they wanted to change the world. So you had this Barry Miles guy who was very much influenced by that. He was a former art college student. He went to London and he worked for a bookshop. I think it was called Better Books in London. And it was one of these shops where they sold alternative kind of books, so avant-garde books. So it's very much beat poetry and avant-garde literature as well. So that's where he came from. And he became friends with John Dunbar. John Dunbar was another guy who said he wanted to change the world. John Dunbar was, at the time that Barry Miles met him, if I'm not mistaken, John Dunbar was going out with Marianne Faithfull, who at the time, who later became famous for becoming Mick Jagger's long-standing girlfriend. And anyone who knows the story about the Mars Bar will know who Marianne Faithfull is.
I don't know that one. Was it straight from the fridge?
It's to do with a drug bust, and the police found a Mars bar when they came in, a drug bust with Mick Jagger and Keith Richards. And yeah, they found a Mars bar lodged somewhere. That's all I'm going to say.
Okay.
Okay.
We can leave that to people's imagination, can't we?
Yeah. Okay, so John Dunbar, before Marianne Faithfull got involved with Mick Jagger, she was married, actually, to John Dunbar. John Dunbar's got an interesting background. Aristocracy, there seems to be an aristocracy, kind of so-called elite background there. His father was involved in war propaganda during the Second World War, which is interesting in itself. There's much more that could be said about that, but I haven't really looked into it in depth yet to be able to talk about it with any sense of authority or confidence. But yeah, his father was involved in war propaganda in terms of film, and I think he was also involved with the British version of what we were talking about before, the Congress of Cultural Freedom. So he was involved in the British version of that, because there was a British version of that. So we've got John Dunbar. So we've got Barry Miles, John Dunbar, and the other guy was Peter Asher. Peter Asher was the brother, is the brother of Jane Asher, the English actress. Jane Asher, at the time that these guys were mixing together, was the girlfriend of Paul McCartney. And Paul McCartney was actually living with Jane and Peter in their house in Wimpole Street in London with their parents. They all shared the family home. Their father, Dr. Richard Asher, was like this eminent doctor who was into sleep hypnosis. Or no, not sleep hypnosis. He practiced hypnosis, and psychosis was part of his speciality as well. So we could go down another, this is such a huge subject, man. We could go down another avenue with that one. So, and Peter Asher, of course, was a musician. He was in the 60s band, or the 60s duo Peter and Gordon, and they had a #1 hit single in 1964, I think it was, with something called The World Without Love. And that was a song that was written by Paul McCartney for Peter Asher, and he recorded it with Peter and Gordon, and they had a huge #1 with it. Now, the money that he got from that #1 hit, which was #1 in America and Britain, he gave to invest in a new business idea. And this business idea involved these three guys that wanted to change the world, being Peter Asher, John Dunbar, and Barry Miles. John Dunbar was into art. That was his thing. Paintings, sculptures, that kind of thing. So, and Barry Miles, as I said before, worked in a bookshop, an avant-garde bookshop. So the idea was that they were going to form a shop or a gallery, sort of half shop, half gallery. So the upstairs would be books, alternative avant-garde books, and the downstairs would be an art gallery, which was where John Dunbar would be in charge. And again, we're talking so-called modern art, avant-garde, pushing the avant-garde artists again. Also music as well. The bookshop also sold music. It sold John Cage's records. It sold Stockhausen. It sold Luciano Berio, who was another one. So it was also a music shop. It sold records and books, everything, anything to do with the avant-garde in terms of that kind of thing. You could find it in the shop in London, which at the time was very, very, very unique. It just wasn't this kind of thing going on. And they called themselves Mad. The actual shop was called Indica, the Indica Gallery and Bookshop, but they called themselves Mad, as in Asher, Dunbar, Miles. So that was their acronym, if you like, MAD. But the bookshop was called Indica. So Paul McCartney, in around 1963, as the Beatlemania thing was going on, and they were singing She Loves You, and they had their mop tops, and they were all cute and lovely on the face of it. Around that time, because Paul McCartney was living with Jane Asher, and was, as a result, living with Peter Asher as well, he got to meet Barry Miles. And it was through Barry Miles that Paul McCartney was turned on to the avant-garde. Barry Miles introduced him to avant-garde art, avant-garde music. So all this kind of music that we were talking about earlier, the John Cage kind of thing, this new kind of stuff that was completely different to what the Beatles were doing at that time. So he introduced him to all of that. He introduced him to all of the literature. And when at the time they were building this shop, Paul McCartney actually went and helped them build it. There's a story that Paul McCartney says himself where he would go to the shop and he'd help put the shelves up and paint the shelves and paint the walls and help them get ready for it. He also helped finance the shop. And once it opened, and Paul McCartney was getting more and more immersed into this new world, there's a quote that Barry Miles has given, because what was happening was the mainstream media picked up on this, because the Beatles, Paul McCartney essentially began to talk about this shop, this gallery. So because he was talking about it, it sort of put the spotlight on this shop. And there's a quote that Barry Miles gave a few years ago. Again, I'm paraphrasing, but he said, the Beatles were the best thing that happened for the avant-garde, because they were like salesmen for it, because they were at the same time, they were the most commercial band in the world and the most famous entertainers in the world, but at the same time they were avant-garde. So they were this huge influential force that could shape culture, which they did, which again, is another subject you could go into and talk about for hours and hours. They shaped culture. here they are talking about avant-garde, the avant-garde way of doing things. So Paul McCartney was getting sort of immersed into this, and through that he got to see a lot of these figures. Like he met Allen Ginsberg, as did John Lennon. Paul McCartney went and saw Luciano Berio, and that was an interesting concert. The way he describes it, they essentially, I think it was that the concert consisted of a guy with a piano, which he ripped all the. I might be wrong, but all I can remember is he ripped all the strings out of it, and that was the performance, like smashing it and breaking the piano, and then he invited the audience to make noises. And Paul McCartney says he got a pen and he started running it up and down the radiator. And this was the concert, basically. This is what this is it. So, and Paul McCartney was getting really into this. And then, of course, with the avant-garde came the LSD, because LSD was very much part of what was going on with the avant-garde world. I mean, Allen Ginsberg was. It's strange, isn't it? Because when you read about MKUltra and how the American military used LSD during the 50s, and they say, according to official accounts, up until the mid-60s, they used LSD from the late 40s up until the mid-60s, unknowingly in projects, in universities, in prisons, in hospitals, and on their own military, to find out ways in which they could torture people, to get the so-called truth out of them, to brainwash, to get assassins. So we've got this drug called LSD, which was only available at that point in time from Sandoz's chemical lab, from Hoffman himself, the guy who's said to have invented it. So we're told that it was only available to psychiatrists within sort of like universities to do experiments. It was available to the military. It was only available to all these people. So how did it seep out in 1965, 66, and suddenly from this closed world where this drug was never heard of in the mainstream, all of a sudden by 1966, 67, we're talking about turn on, tune in, drop out. We're talking about everyone's on LSD, in terms of the summer of love and everything. How did that happen? You look at some of the people that were hanging around. I mean, the mainstream will say it's just one of those things. Oh, look, it just suddenly happened, but they never give you an explanation as to how it happened, because they won't, will they? But you look at some of the people that were involved at the time in the 1960s in the avant-garde, and that were mixing with the likes of the Beatles, and that were part of the so-called counterculture that began to sweep in 66, 67. And it's people like Allen Ginsberg. Allen Ginsberg was given LSD as part of MKUltra back in the 50s, if I'm not mistaken. I think he took part in trials. And he first took part in LSD. The first time he took LSD was part of an MKUltra experiment. And then you've got Ken Kesey, who was the author of One Flew Over the Cuckoo's Nest. Here is a guy who, before he took LSD and an MKUltra test, says he never drank, he never smoked, he'd never taken drugs. He was this pro football player, really sporty guy. And he's at university one day and he gets offered some money because, as I say, they were testing this LSD out on guinea pigs, not telling them what they were testing them on in a lot of the cases. So you've got this guy called Ken Kesey, who's in an American university. He gets asked if he wants to earn a few extra dollars. He goes, yeah, okay. So he takes part in these LSD trials, MKUltra. And before you know it, he's working in, this is his version of events, he's working in a mental asylum, I think it was. And he managed to be able to break into the office and steal thousands of acid tabs and go off and then form a troupe of people called the Merry Pranksters, who drove around in a bus around America in 64, 65, handing out LSD. So I'm to believe that this guy, who was this sport-loving teetotaler, takes part in an MKUltra experiment, or a few of them, and at the other end manages to break into an office where he's working as a porter, I think it was, or something like that, or a warden, and he manages to break into an office and steal a load of trips and then go around America handing out acid. And then he wrote One Flew Over the Cuckoo's Nest as well, based on what he saw in those asylums as well. That's what he says. So you've got all these people that all of a sudden have become like the godfathers of the counterculture, who just happen to be involved in MKUltra, who just happen to then manage to get hold of these drugs and manage to hand them out, whereas before they were only available to certain closed sector of people. All of a sudden they're appearing in nightclubs and concerts. I mean, I think it was Ken Kesey, he hired a band called the Outlaws, and he held the acid tests, he called them, which were basically events where people went to take acid, and music was provided by the Outlaws, and the Outlaws later became the Grateful Dead. Are you telling me this is all just accidental? It doesn't sound accidental to me. But anyway, so bringing this into the British way of looking at it in London, basically what happened was we have this avant-garde scene taking place in London, and we've got Allen Ginsberg, who's taken LSD, has become hooked into the philosophy of LSD, and he's going around talking about it and bigging it up. So we've got all this going on in London, all these people taking LSD. There's various other people as well that were coming in as well that were doing that at the time. Barry Miles is central to this, because Barry Miles is essentially involved in everything that happened in the London counterculture. He started the first alternative newspaper called IT, International Times. It's meant to be the first international, the first alternative newspaper in Europe. So it was a newspaper where you'd read alternative news, and you could also find out where you could get your drugs from. It would tell you the dealer of the week and all this kind of thing. So Barry Miles was very central to this. Another figure that should be brought in at this point, who was also handing out drugs, was a guy called Michael Hollingshead. And I know I'm rambling, and I'll try not to ramble too much. Michael Hollingshead was a philosopher and a writer, and he's actually the guy. He's British, and again, this is another reason why we should take a look at Britain as being important in terms of the counterculture. Michael Hollingshead is the man. He's British, and he's actually the man who introduced Timothy Leary to LSD. So if you want to talk about Timothy Leary and his turn on, tune in, drop out, if it hadn't have been for Michael Hollingshead, it might not have happened. Michael Hollingshead, as I say, was this philosopher. He was also a writer, and he got into LSD. He seemed to have a relationship going with Aldous Huxley. The thing with Michael Hollingshead is there's not much written about him. I know there's a new biography coming out about him in a few months. I don't know what this writer's going to find out about him, but he's one of these mysterious characters where no one really knows much about his history. No one knows where he was born, what he did before he became what he became. He's a very shady character in terms of his background. Anyway, he was this philosopher and a writer, and he somehow had a friendship going with Aldous Huxley, and he was corresponding with Aldous Huxley about LSD. This was back in the 50s or very early 60s, and he was talking about this new drug, LSD, and what Aldous Huxley's views on it were. And he discovered that Aldous Huxley had been taking it quite recently at that time as well. And Aldous Huxley suggested to Michael Hollingshead that he should go to America. And Aldous Huxley, of course, again, British, another godfather of the counterculture scene with his book, Doors of Perception. So he suggested he should go to America. Michael Hollingshead should go to America and hook up with a guy who was doing research into magic mushrooms to see the effect on the mind. And he was doing this research work at Harvard University. And this guy was Timothy Leary, Professor Timothy Leary. So he said he should go to America, see Timothy Leary, and introduce him to LSD, see what he thought about it. So that's what he did. This is according to Michael Hollingshead himself, who wrote kind of his own biography. But again, he begins it in 1960. He doesn't tell you anything about his prior life to that and how he got to be a philosopher, quote unquote, and writer, quote unquote. But he went to America, and he met with Timothy Leary, who was indeed doing research into magic mushrooms and the effects of magic mushrooms at Harvard University. And if you want to talk about Timothy Leary and the claims that he was CIA, it's never been fully confirmed, but the suspicions are definitely there. It just so happens that he was working on the effects of magic mushrooms on the mind at Harvard at the same time that MKUltra was doing similar research at the same university. So take that which way you want to. So he met with Michael Hollingshead, and he effectively, essentially, eventually introduced Timothy Leary to LSD. He'd taken mushrooms before, but he'd never taken LSD, and he was a little bit reticent. He was a little bit, he wasn't sure at first whether we should do this, but in the end he did, and it was like a new religion to him, as it is with a lot of people who take LSD. It's like he'd seen God, So effectively, from that point onwards, he turned on and tuned in, and the rest, as they say, is history. Then Timothy Leary essentially became like this prophet, if you like, for LSD. While Michael Hollingshead was in America with Timothy Leary, he took part in some experiments with Timothy Leary at Harvard at around the same time that all this MKUltra stuff was going on there, on the effects of psychedelics on the mind. And they were doing this, I think it was called the Concord experiments. I might be wrong, but I think the Concord experiments was linked to both Hollingshead and Timothy Leary. And this is where, again, if I'm not mistaken, they were testing unknowingly on prison inmates the effects of psychedelics. So that was going on. Then around 1965, and I should just point out that Michael Hollingshead was also, as well as being a philosopher, quote unquote, and a writer, quote unquote, was also a director of what was, I think, was called the American Committee of the Culture of Freedom, or something like that. He was basically, we were talking earlier about the Congress of Cultural Freedom, where he was essentially working for an offshoot of that CIA-backed Congress for Cultural Freedom, which was called the American Institute, or the American Committee for Cultural Exchange in America, which was like a British American exchange thing. I can't remember the exact name of it, but effectively, in his words, what this committee was a propaganda arm of culture from Britain to America. And one of the directors on that board was a guy by the name, I think his name was Lionel Trilling. I think his second name is Trilling, but I think his full name was Lionel Trilling. And Lionel Trilling was a member of the actual Congress of Cultural Freedom, this CIA-backed association, organization, and he was a knowing member of that as well. He was like one of the head honchos of that. So already we've got Hollingshead linked to possible CIA links to Leary and MKUltra and Harvard, and also to this American Cultural Committee that's linked to the Congress of Cultural Freedom with, which I talked about earlier. So with that in mind, when we're talking about the avant-garde and the Congress of Cultural Freedom pushing the avant-garde, so with that in mind, and with Theo Adorno in mind, and Darmstadt in mind, all of that in mind, in 1965, Michael Hollingshead was asked by Leary to go to Britain, to come back to Britain, and to stage a mass rally at the Royal Albert Hall. And this mass rally at the Royal Albert Hall was effectively to hand out trips and to have a massive, great big concert. And the concert should have the Rolling Stones and the Beatles on stage. And the whole point of this concert should be to promote LSD to the younger generation. So we're talking 1965. So we're talking 2 years before the so-called Summer of Love. This is what the plans were back then, 2 years before. And it was planned that Timothy Leary was going to come over later to take part in this Royal Albert Hall concert. And he was going to come on at the end after the Beatles and the Stones had played and do this great big, sermon to the masses or what have you. But what happened was Leary got arrested towards the end of '65, if I'm not mistaken. I think he was arrested, so he couldn't leave the country. So effectively, Michael Hollingshead had to carry on this mission in Britain on his own, which he did. He came to Britain. In his words, he came armed with thousands of trips, which he'd got from I can't remember, from Switzerland, I think it was. Can't remember where, but he came armed with thousands of trips, ready to turn on the youth. His aim was to turn on the young people, the young generation. Leary was doing it in America. Michael Hollingshead was going to do it back in his native Britain. The first thing he did when he got to London, once he got off the plane, was to open the World Psychedelic Centre, the WPC. And he did this in a house in the West End of London. And this is where Barry Miles and Peter Asher and all these people hook up again, because when he hooked up in London, he hooked up with all these like-minded people that were supportive of what he was doing. So he, as I say, he hooked up with McCartney's friends, and McCartney was a visitor to the World Psychedelic Centre at this house, as was Donovan, the singer Donovan, as was Roman Polanski, as was Sharon Tate, as was Keith Richards, as were a number of other so-called beautiful people of the 60s, including a lot of aristocrats and so-called elites that were mixing in London in the counterculture of that time. And that went on for about a year. He was just giving out free trips. The whole point of this World Psychedelic Centre in this house was to bring people in to pass the word on, basically. Pass the word on to Keith Richards, pass the word on to Paul McCartney, pass the word on to Barry Miles, and all these people to send on the message to the wider world of the beauty of LSD, how you could see God on LSD and how we could change the world and make it a much better place. The mess that the politicians, that the square old men had put it into. So that was Michael Hollingshead's involvement in all of that. A CIA agent.
We've gone over his time.
I know. I thought we might have done.
We've gone over by about 7 minutes, but it's fascinating stuff. We're going to have you back on so you can continue this tangent that you're going on.
Okay, so shall I just wrap up with the Theo Adorno then?
Yeah, you do that. I'm just going to go because I need to go. I'm just you carry on. It's okay. People are going to be watching. I just really need to go and do something in the kitchen.
Okay, all right then.
Go on, you carry on.
All right. Okay, so to wrap it up, how this boils down to Theo Adorno, in my view. So we had, so here we have 1965-66. What happened was Michael Hollingshead, there was a bust at his house, and it became national headline news. And could be argued that it was done on purpose in a way that to put it in the national headlines, because part of the national headline was that there was this drug called LSD. Now, at this point in late 65, early 66, not many people would have known what LSD was. People within the sort of the inner London, inner clique as it was, would have known what LSD was, let alone people who lived in Manchester or Leeds or where I live on the East Coast. We wouldn't have. It was pretty much an unknown entity. So you could argue that when Michael Hollingshead was busted and his World Psychedelic Centre was taken down at the end of 66, and this was all put out in the tabloid press, it could be argued that it was done on purpose, so that LSD would become this national story and that LSD would become attractive to the younger generation. So it was around that time also that Paul McCartney became public with his sort of use of LSD. He began to talk about it in the mainstream media, and the turning point musically with the Beatles came in '66 with the Revolver album, and it was the Revolver album. There was a track on there called "Tomorrow Never Knows," and if you've ever heard that track, I can imagine anyone who heard it at the time was probably thinking it sounded like it's like something out of outer space, because it's probably the first ever commercial song to feature samples, tape loops. Probably the first ever commercial song to have samples and tape loops. haunting song, but it was based on the Timothy Leary book, which was based on the Tibetan Book of the Dead, which is about LSD. Effectively, this is a book about tripping your nuts, sort of turn off your mind and float downstream. Was one of the passages from this Timothy Leary book that John Lennon took and used in this Tomorrow Never Knows song. And that's the turning point musically, because the Beatles have said not only is that song inspired by the Timothy Leary book, which they picked up at the Indica bookshop owned by Barry Miles and his friends, but it was also inspired by the avant-garde music, featuring tape loops, which is another thing that the avant-garde musicians did. We had tape loops, sampling, funny sounds going on, and that's very much what the avant-garde scene was about. And you get that in Sgt. Pepper as well, A Day in the Life, where you've got the orchestra going up at the end and in the middle of the song. I Am the Walrus with the radio tuning at the end, which again is back to the avant-garde sounds. You had the whole psychedelic thing going on with Sgt. Pepper and Magical Mystery Tour, and this track Tomorrow Never Knows, which is based on this book that the Beatles had read and picked up from Barry Miles' shop, all based on the avant-garde. So to round it all off, my contention is let's forget that Theo Adorno wrote the Beatles songs. Let's assume that if Theo Adorno was involved in anything to do with the Beatles and cultural engineering, social engineering, let's entertain the idea that maybe it was through his promotion of the avant-garde that, and as a result, the avant-garde's foundation within the counterculture and the LSD and the counterculture change that came with it. Maybe that's what Theo Adorno and the Beatles was all about. That's what I've been trying to say in a very long-winded way. Let's forget that he wrote their songs. Basically, it could be that Theo Adorno was part of something to bring about the 1967 so-called Summer of Love, with the help of the Beatles, who were, as Barry Miles said, the most commercial band on the earth, but also the most influential and the most avant-garde. There you go.
Superb. Well, listen, it's been absolutely fantastic speaking to you tonight, and thanks very much for agreeing to come on. And you did express a few worries to me beforehand that you didn't think that you'd be able to get as much information out as you probably wanted to, but you have, certainly. It's been absolutely fantastic. Where can people find your work?
Well, there's a couple of places there's 3 places. They can go take a look at my Facebook, which is Conspiro Media, Facebook, or they can go to my blog, which is Conspiro Media WordPress, or the Occult Beatles, which is where and a lot of the stuff overlaps because the Beatles is 1960s, and as you found tonight, it all overlaps. You know, what I'm tending to do, as I said right at the beginning of this chat tonight, is I'm focusing on the 1960s, and you'll find that if you look on my blog, Conspiro Media, the WordPress site, there's not a lot on there at the moment. I don't post a lot of stuff on there, and that's because I'm still researching the stuff and collating it and putting it together. But don't give up. Don't give up on me. I will be posting stuff on there in the near future. I think I've got to a point now where I should maybe put some of this stuff out in article form. It's not finished, but I think I should put something out there.
Well, it's going to take you, as far as I'm concerned, it's going to take you ages to write it.
It will. It will.
There's just so much information in there, isn't there?
But if you go to the Facebook version of Conspiro Media, I do post on there quite regularly, so you'll see little bits and pieces up on there. Nothing lengthy, but just little bits and pieces that I've come across that I feel that I can put up straight away. That won't matter so much. I'll do that. And the Occult Beatles site is regularly updated. But a lot of what I've been talking about tonight with regards to Theo Adorno and the avant-garde and the counterculture and how it all mixes together and how it might be connected to the Beatles when you look at Theo Adorno and the Beatles, I will be putting what I've been talking about tonight into an article. because there's believe it or not, there's a hell of a lot I've left out, which takes into account people like William Sargent, and various others. Also the Ashers, the Asher family. There's a lot that could be said about Jane Asher's father, who would have become Paul McCartney's father-in-law. Actually, if you look on my Occult Beatles site at the moment, I've got a little piece about Dr. Richard Asher and his. There's some claims that he was involved in MKUltra type experiments in the 60s, and seeing how that might have affected Paul McCartney in particular. So yeah, it's all a work in progress at the moment, but I would say do be patient with me. I am still reading, I am still collating stuff in terms of the 60s, but I think I am coming to the point now where I'm going to have to start upping the game a little bit and putting stuff on the internet just to keep the interest going, because if people go to a site and they see that it hasn't been updated for a few weeks or a few months or whatever, they'll think, oh, this guy's obviously given up and stopped doing it. But I haven't. That's the thing. I'm still around. I'm still doing it. It's just that I haven't felt ready to go public with a lot of it. But as I say, if you go to the Beatles site or the Facebook page, you'll find there are bits. There's always stuff going on.
Excellent.
And thank you for having me. I don't know how boring I've been. I've tried not to be boring. I've tried not to ramble and become confusing, because it is a massive subject. It really is massive. And there's so many interconnecting webs and things, and it's very difficult to keep to the main point of a story, go off into a tangent and try and keep in mind of the main point without going off and forgetting where you were and going off and not coming back again. And so hopefully I've been okay with that tonight, and I haven't gone off too much. And yeah, thanks for having me, man.
It's been absolutely smashing, and thanks to everyone who's been joining in the chat room. Good people in there. It's a good bunch. They're all nice to each other. Jack Tamson's dogs just said, "I love this guy." So there you go, Matt. You've got a big fan already from this show tonight. Well, listen, thanks very much to everybody for listening. Thanks to Matt for coming along. I'll be back sometime this week. I don't know. I don't think it'll be tomorrow, but I think probably a little bit later on in the week, probably a 9 o'clock start or something like that, just for a couple of hours. I did have another guest lined up, but I'm having second thoughts, and so I don't want to commit myself to that.
We're going to have someone on tomorrow. I thought you said you were going to have. Because I checked out one of your updates on YouTube a couple of days ago, and you said you might have been having someone on tomorrow. Tuesday.
Yeah, I'm thinking about it. I'm just having second thoughts. So there'll be something on. There'll be something on later on in the week, or maybe even tomorrow. You never know what's going to happen in the next 24 hours. So anyway, listen. Thanks to everyone for listening. Thanks to Matt, and thanks to YouTube. How long will last? I do not know, because everyone's dropping like flies.
And they keep messing with the viewing figures.
Yes, they do. Yes, they do. They certainly do. So. We'll see you again later on in the week. Don't give up, like Matt says. You don't give up. You keep going, and you keep going, and you keep going, and you keep going. And even if things like feel like they're completely on top of you and everything, you keep going. Just so you can focus. Keep going. Never give up. See you later. Ta-ra a bit.